the first slide. Here we have the design of the current style of our Malmark choir chime. It's essentially a giant tuning fork if you look at it. When it comes down to it, you've got the tuning slot on the left-hand side of the diagram that determines the pitch of the choir chime. You'll see the clapper mechanism is attached to the top of the chime. One very important thing that pretty much makes a choir chime what it is not shown in that diagram, so I'm going to ask her to take that down just for a moment. Because in the bottom, I don't know how well you can see it, but there is a plug right in there. That's going to give us the resonating chamber that gives our tuning fork volume and turns it into a choir chime. So now we have a couple of different versions of choir chimes. If you've got an old set prior to the early 90s, you may have one that looks kind of like this. It has anodized aluminum, whereas our current ones, we have moved to powder coating. It's very nice, clean looking. And you'll also see the old style clapper is very different looking, as well as the thumb guard. Now the bad news is we do not refurbish the old style ones anymore, but you can still do, tweaking and adjustments on them. So the old style one has bearing screws in the base of the bearing block. You can see those black dots there. Those are the bearing screws. Those are going to control the clapper tension. The new style also has bearing screws, but they're a lot easier to find because they're right on the side there, those little hex screws. And again, it's going to control the tension of the ringing motion. So the clapper shaft is held onto the thumb guard by those bearing screws. And if you have lateral movement in your clapper mechanism, in other words, if it's shifting side to side, you're going to need to tighten those bearing screws. And the size of the hex key that you're going to need is going to depend on the type of chime that you have. If you have our current style, you'll be using a 5/64 hex key that comes with your chimes. And incidentally, it is the same size that your handbells take, most of your handbells, so that's good. If you have the older one, it's a little bit smaller, thinner. It is a 1/16 inch hex key. And if you have misplaced it after 20 or 30 years, you can call us up and get another one. And the other difference with the old style is the bumper block. The bumper block on the old style is rectangular, and therefore the only way that you can adjust it is to slide it up and down the shaft. And what that does is that is going to change the height of the clapper that as it rests against the tube. So if you were to slide it up, then it's going to move it further away. And if you push it back, then it'll be lower. Now on the current style, which is what most of you probably have, it's completely different and a lot easier to do. It's actually this round bumper right here. And if you were to look at it, you can't see it in the diagram, but if you have one in front of you and look at it, you'll see that there's a little pinhole in there. And what that does is that marks the thickest part of that bumper, so that as you turn it, the thicker side is going to cause the clapper to be up higher, and the thinner side, if you keep rotating it, will lower it again. It doesn't matter which direction that you turn it, as long as you understand that the pinhole, what the pinhole does and designates. Now onto the clapper heads. C5 through C8 has the same design clapper head, varying hardnesses, but the same design where they have multiple settings as you go around. The reason for that is because choir chimes were designed partially to be cost effective compared to bells. So we want to be able to use the same clapper head for a wide range of them. But they are not meant to be quick adjusted like your handbells are. These are factory set, so we do not advise that you change the clapper head settings on your choir chimes. And also very important, if you do want to change it, you actually have to disassemble it, remove the clapper head entirely, move it to the new setting, and put the screws back in. They cannot be twisted and turned like the Handbell clapper heads because they have a hexagonal shape inside. So by turning that, you would damage the clapper head and possibly the clapper shaft. Now, lower chimes, C4 to B4, depending on the age of your set. Currently, they have the rubber clapper head, but some older ones, and I think I may have misplaced it, but we also have older ones that had felt heads. The felt heads are fine, but they do wear easily, so we do recommend that if you haven't updated them to the rubber ones already, that you go ahead and do so. They give better sound quality and they last much longer. So you're probably wondering, well, how do I take my clapper apart, or my choir chime apart? Here we have an example of the assembly screws. If you were to punch through the label on your choir chime, you'll see that there are two screws in here. These are the assembly screws. This holds the entire clapper mechanism to your chime. Now, if these screws were to come loose, it is possible that, and in fact, I will loosen these just to show you a little bit what could happen. You could see that this could wiggle back and forth. So if your screws haven't been tightened in a while and you see this back and forth movement side to side, you'll want to punch through that label, and you're going to want to tighten those screws back up after you've straightened your clapper assembly. And so we're going to tighten that back up. And voila, no more movement. Okay, and the old style chimes, by the way, they do work the same way, except that it may be a little bit harder to punch through because it's a different type of screw, a different type of thumb guard, but essentially if you can get that label out of the way, there are screws underneath there to do the same type of thing. However, if you are looking to change out the entire clapper assembly, you're only going to be doing that on the new style, because if something goes wrong with your old style chime, say if your tube is cracked, you can't replace the old style tube. You would have to replace the entire chime, because the screws on the thumb guard, the distance between them was changed. So the old style clapper is not interchangeable with a new style tube. And let's go to our choir chime maintenance checklist. There are 4 main points of maintenance for choir chimes, no matter what type you have. You want to always make sure that this clapper head screw that holds the clapper head on, make sure that that stays tight. If it loosens, you may get some rattling sounds, but if you want to tighten it, just take a small flathead screwdriver, hold this down firmly, tighten it up, and that should hopefully eliminate your sound problems. If the thumb guard is turning, as we mentioned before, you would straighten it and then tighten these 2 screws here. Bearing screws, this is probably what you're going to need the most. If those bearing screws loosen up over years of ringing, you would need your hex tool, in this case my 5/64, and just insert it in there. And this one's being stubborn, there we go. And just adjust it a little bit at a time. And it's also important that you do the other side evenly. You don't want to do just all of your adjusting on one side, or it's going to feel a little weird. So just small increments on each side until you get the tension that feels right. The kind of tension that you're looking for is you want the clapper to move freely on its own. That's a little stiff. Okay. You want to move freely on its own, but not be so loose that it's rebounding a lot. Okay, so you need to find that happy medium, and you'll need to experiment with that. I'll show you what it looks like if it's way too loose, so that you know what I'm talking about. I'm gonna loosen that way back. That's too loose. So you want to shoot for that happy medium where it moves freely but isn't excessively bouncing. Okay. Now, for bass chimes, if you have bass notes that are B3 and lower, you should have received tine inserts, also known as tine protectors, that go inside the top of the tines. I did not bring one with me, but those are there to protect your tines. So anytime you're not using those bass chimes and you're putting them back in the case, you want to make sure that those tine protectors go back into the chimes. Or, maybe you've got your chimes out, in your rehearsal area, someone's walking around, somebody steps on one. Ugh, you don't want that. Those tine protectors are very important. If you've lost your tine protectors, call us up, you can get more. Troubleshooting on chimes is not too hard. Most likely thing that you're going to have is buzzing or rattling. Buzzing when you're ringing is could be a couple things. It could be that loose clapper head screw that we talked about earlier. The other cause of a buzzing sound, particularly if the drop in pitch is obvious, then you probably have a cracked tube. Tubes cannot be repaired, but they can be replaced. And if you have the current style, assuming that there's nothing wrong with your clapper mechanism, you can replace the tube and reuse your clapper mechanism. And I'm going to take this apart real quick to show you just how easy it is. I am just taking out those two screws that we saw earlier. Okay. When you get a replacement tube, you'll see that there are two holes drilled in there already for you. And so all you have to do is line up those screws with those holes and tighten it back down. And by the way, if you are ordering a new tube to replace a cracked one, we will automatically send you a new thumb guard label to cover up those unsightly holes. So, easy as pie. Now, something else you may experience is a short sustain, and that can be one of two things. It could be the beginning of a tube cracking, but it could also be the plug inside that we talked about may have become dislodged. It may have even fallen out entirely. The plug placement is very important. It's very precise. If it's off by as much as even a 1/16 of an inch, it can affect how well it resonates. So short sustain could mean that that plug is moved a little bit. It could have even fallen out entirely. Now, this is an example of a cracked chime. I don't know how well it's going to sound over Zoom, but you'll hear that the sustain is very short. Yeah, so once it gets to that point, this one is cracked, so you can't do anything with that but change out the tube, as we talked about. Now, as we said before, if your old style one is cracked, you just have to replace the entire chime. So, cleaning your chimes is fairly easy. You can do it one of two ways. Pre-COVID, what we would do was just take a little bit of dish detergent and dilute it in some water. Take a soft, clean rag, dip that in there, and just wash it with the soapy water, and then dry it with a dry cloth. Now that we're more concerned with germs, you can take a Clorox wipe or Lysol disposable wipe, that type of thing, and you can wipe down all of the outside of the chime. You can also wipe down the top of the thumb guard. That's fine too. The one area that you would want to avoid, however, is the rubber bumper, that adjustment bumper that we talked about. You don't want that rubber to dry out. In fact, if you have this style, if you see that it moves too easily, that rubber bumper, it's probably starting to dry rot, in which case you'll want to get that bumper replaced. That's something that you have to send it into the factory to be done. It's not something that you can do at home, unfortunately. If you see that that round bumper is sliding up and down the shaft, that's also a sign that it's gotten too loose from dry rotting. because these new style ones are not meant to move from the base of that where the yoke is. So at this time, we'll pause for some questions. If you have a question about the choir chimes, go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up, and I'll try to answer your questions. No questions? Okay, well, we're going to move on to bells then. Hyosung, could you pull up the diagram of the full handbell? Okay, so here we have a blow-up diagram of the parts of the bell. And some of the parts are pretty obvious. You have the handle. You have the handguard, which, as the name suggests, it guards your hand from touching the casting. You have the clapper mechanism. And you have the most important part, the casting. The casting is made of bronze, which is 80% copper and 20% tin, roughly. And lastly, a couple little things you need are these lock washers. There's going to be one underneath the casting, and there's going to be one on top of the casting. These are going to keep the casting from shifting around after you tighten your main assembly screw. And the main assembly screw is what goes through the handle. It's going to go down through the casting into the clapper shaft. That's going to hold your whole bell together. So as you can imagine, it's pretty important that that stays tight. So, and these are heat treated, so it takes a lot to break them, but it's not impossible. If they are kept loose for too long and they're being wrung a lot, you can actually shear off that screw. So it's very important that you periodically go through your set and make sure all of those main assembly screws are tight. And so going into the clapper mechanism itself, this is probably the most complicated part of the bell. We have this top portion we refer to as the handle yoke coupler assembly, or coupler for short. It has your restraining springs attached to it, which that is going to control the distance between the clapper and the casting when it's at rest. That's probably one of the things you're going to be dealing with the most as far as adjustments is the restraining springs. This coupler is attached to the yoke by those bearing screws that we talked about. And then we have the shaft. Depending on the size of the clapper, you may have a weight like this one. Smaller ones will not have one. And then you'll have the clapper head. In between that weight and the clapper head is something very important that I want to show you with you. This is a clapper indexing spring. And what that does is that helps the clapper head snap into place. And if you are replacing your clapper head, you need to be very careful to not change the position of the indexing spring. As you can see, the center of that is square shaped. So if it is misoriented by 90 degrees, then your slots are not going to line up properly. Those slots, the slot has to line up with the direction that the clapper is swinging, or else you are not going to be happy trying to ring it in between settings. Okay, so thank you, Hyosung. She brought me the example I was missing earlier. We'll come back to that. So we need to also talk about the fifth octave, the lower fifth octave clapper assembly, because it's a little bit different. With the regular clapper, head, there is a little pin up there that is what is snapping into this slot to make the clapper head go into the right position. But with these big ones from F#3 and lower, it actually works a little bit opposite, because the slots are actually on the bottom of the clapper head itself, and instead of the pin, the weight on the clapper actually has a spring-loaded ball on the other side. So that is how that one works. But it's basically the same idea. And I'm not sure if Hyosong's made it back to her desk, but if she has, she can pop up the diagram of those as an example. There we go. So you'll see near the top of the diagram that weight and those balls that are spring-loaded in there, that takes the place of the pin that is on the smaller clapper heads. Okay. And if you want to flip to the next slide, depending on the age of your bells, you may have, assuming you have bass bells, that is, you may have the newer clapper head, which is a 4-position head that's shown on the left side of the diagram. If you have older bells and maybe they haven't been refurbished, or maybe they were but you didn't feel ready to update them, they may have these older black ones that is just a single felt. Which means as you turn it 90 degrees, it's just going to go from the soft setting to the hard setting and back again. The advantage of the 4-position head is that now you, instead of 2 choices of timbre, now you have 4 choices. So you have a soft, a medium hard, and a hard timbre. The other advantage is that if one of them wears down, you don't have to replace all of them. You can just you can first rotate it to a fresh position. If it's all of the positions are worn, then you can just take out that particular felt and replace it. Whereas with the old ones, you have to replace the entire felt. So now on to the most important part, maintenance of the bells. So we talked about keeping the main assembly screw as tight as possible. But what do you do that with? We need to make sure we have the proper tools. Probably the most important tool in your arsenal is going to be a long flathead screwdriver. And you want it to be long enough that the handle of the screwdriver extends higher than the handle. If you're trying to work with a itty-bitty screwdriver like this, it's not going to work. So make sure you get one that is long enough and a head that is large enough, roughly the size of the screw itself. For larger bells, such as the lower 5th octave range, C3 to F sharp 3, you might need one that's even thicker and stronger because those are a little bit harder to tighten. So using the proper tools is very important. The next tool that you may need is just a smaller flathead. This is used to adjust the restraining springs on the inside of your bell. It can also be used to tighten the clapper head screw should it come loose. But that's something that you're going to want to take your entire bell apart to do it safely, because you really can't get the proper leverage if the clapper is still in the bell. And a safety issue, if you are using screwdrivers, you'll see that I've got one glove on and one glove off. There is a reason for that. We don't want you to slip. If I had a glove on this hand, there's a chance that I could slip and hurt myself. So if you're using a screwdriver, please take the glove off of your dominant hand before you use the screwdriver. Another tool, and this is specifically for our handles, we have a very short-handled Phillips head. And we have not just one, but we have 2. And the reason for this is because these handle screws that hold the strap onto the handle block, it's actually a combination of a screw and a hollow coupler assembly that it screws into. And what that means is if you're trying to use only one screwdriver, these could actually start turning as a pair and then you're not going anywhere. So in order to tighten the handle screws, you're going to want to use one of the Phillips heads to keep the coupler stationary, and then you can use the other one on the front side to actually do the tightening. Just like so. Okay. And also the hex keys that we talked about with the chimes can also be used with the bells. The 5/64 hex key will fit everything G3 and higher. And if you have bass bells, F sharp 3 and lower, the 1/8 hex key will do the trick. Now, On smaller bells, if you've ever tried to adjust your bearing screws, you've probably noticed that it can be kind of hard to get in there with the hex key that you get from the factory. It's a good idea to go onto Jeffers' website and get a long-handled hex key. Now, this is not from Jeffers, but this is what we have at the factory, where you can see it's much easier to reach into the bell with that than to try to stick your whole hand in there with a small little hex key. So it's a very good investment if you can get one. So troubleshooting some things. The most common thing is loose bearing screws and improperly adjusted springs. When I'm adjusting bells back here, I actually adjust the bearing screws before I even touch the restraining springs. The reason for that is if your bearing screws are too loose, it won't really matter what you do to the springs, it's never going to feel right. Until that ringing tension is set correctly, the springs can't really do their job properly. So I'm going to give you an example of some maladjusted or improperly adjusted maybe a little bit more because I want it to be really obvious. Okay. When I'm ringing this, you see how it's bouncing and rebounding quite a bit? You don't want quite that much because you're going to end up with double ringing. Even if your springs are set tighter, if those bearing screws are too loose, you're going to get way too much rebound, and you shouldn't be bouncing around quite like that. So oftentimes when people have loose bearing screws, they make the mistake of tightening the restraining springs instead. And what that's going to cause is, number one, carpal tunnel, because your ringers are going to be struggling to ring through that extra restraint on the springs. The second thing it's going to cause is cracking of your restraining springs. The restraining springs should last a long time if they're properly adjusted. But if they're tightened too much, they can crack. Or if they've been in a closet for 20 years, they're going to get hard and brittle and they'll crack. But if with proper adjustment, they should last quite a long time. My church's set has lasted almost 30 years. Not that I'm encouraging you to wait that long, but if you take care of your bells, they can last a long time. So as far as maintenance, the things that you want to look for in your set, you want to keep that main assembly screw tight at all times. Check it at least every 6 months. If you ring a lot, you might want to check it every couple months. You also want to check those handle screws. Remember that you're going to use both of those tiny little screwdrivers for that. Check the clapper head screws, but chances are you won't even have to check for that because your ringers are going to tell you first. Your ringers are going to say, my head is spinning, and not this head, but this head. If that clapper head screw is too loose, it will spin around and it will not snap into that position properly. So they'll probably tell you before you have to even look for that. You can check for cracked springs, and that can be a little bit harder to see, especially on a small bell, but you might be able to feel it because it may just sort of thud and not rebound properly. Another thing that we recommend after every rehearsal is wiping down your bells with a sunshine cloth. Now, if you have the old version known as a Shino cloth that has the red rouge in it, those work too. However, they leave a mess of rouge all over your plastic parts and it stains and it's not so pretty. Nowadays, the sunshine cloth is the method of choice. It does still have a dry polishing compound embedded in it, so you use it by itself. You don't use it with any polish. You just use it by itself. Wipe off any of the fresh prints that you may have gotten, because you can sweat through your gloves, and still get prints on the bells, even if you're being careful and your hands are covered. So this will take off any fresh stains. And you may think, well, is it really that big of a deal? It is, because as being in the refurbishing department for so many years, I've seen uh, all kinds of things. If you get body acids on your bells, you know, maybe you're sneezing, you're coughing, speaking, you spit a little bit, those body acids will collect on those castings. And if they stay on there long enough, it will actually eat away at the metal. And once that starts to happen, you can't remove it eating away. It etches into the metal. You might be able to remove the superficial part of the stain, but the etching will always be there. The only way to remove etching is to remove metal, and that's going to change the tune of your casting. So you don't want to do that. So that's why we really encourage the Sunshine Claws to keep those castings nice and clean. The part that you've all been waiting for is probably how to take apart your bells. So we're going to do that. Again, you want your long-handled screwdriver. And you just place the bell up on its end on a table. And insert the screwdriver there, turn counterclockwise until you can fully remove that main assembly screw. And remember, no glove on this hand, right? That comes off. And right after that, you can just lift off the handguard. You'll see the first of 2 lock washers. And the type of lock washer that's on there may depend on the range of the bells. We have different sizes depending on the range. Then you can lift the casting off. And there is, on top of the clapper, there is the second lock washer that we talked about. And then you're left with the clapper. And to put it back together, you're really just going to reverse that. As you're taking it apart, it's good to have it lined up in the same direction that you took it off so that you're not flipping things around as you're putting it back together. So I have kept the clapper in the same direction. We're going to take that casting, just put it right on top. Lock washer goes back on around there. Handguard orientation is important because if you can see, there is a recessed area. That's where your handle is going to fit into it. And we're going to talk about that more when I show you how to do a handle replacement without taking your whole bell apart. So that is going to go back on there. And the handle will slip right over there. And you're going to just retighten that. But you're not done yet, so hang on. If you've ever looked at the inside of your bells, you're going to notice that, and I doubt that you're going to be able to see it on the video, but in fact, I'm pretty sure you won't be able to see it. Take my word for it. There is a vertical scratch inside your bell. That is called a scribe, and that marks the best sounding strike point on your bell because the bell does not sound the same all the way around. There are inconsistencies with porosity that can cause, minor fluctuations in the tonal quality. So when your bells are born, they go through a voicing process where we decide where it sounds best, and we mark it permanently. So before you fully tighten that main assembly screw, you want to make it tight enough that it's not spinning uncontrollably, but still that you can pull it around because you are going to pull the casting around until the clapper lines up with that scribe mark. And then you're going to put it back on the table and finish tightening it. And get that tight as humanly possible. And now you've got your finished handbell. Now, probably another more common thing that you'll need to do is just to replace the handle strap if it's cracked. And you don't necessarily have to disassemble the whole bell to do that. You can take your twin Phillips heads and your long-handled screwdriver. You're only going to loosen that screw just enough that you can just lift the handle strap out of that recessed area, but you're not going to unscrew it all the way. And then you are going to remove those handle screws. And remember, hold one on the back side and the other one turns. And we'll take out the other one. like so. And you can actually just wiggle that out and remove the strap. The block is still attached to the rest of your bell. And you'll get your new strap in the mail from us, and you'll just reverse that process. You will put those couplers through the holes in the handle block. Oops. Which is hard to see when it's all black. And put the screw back in there. You can sort of thread it with your fingers first before you actually go in there with the screwdriver, just to make sure it's threaded correctly. And then back with that. Okay. And as you're tightening these screws that last bit, you want to make sure that the base of the handle is fitting into that recessed area. Then you're going to go back and mostly tighten the main assembly screw, but not all the way, because once again, you have to line up your scribe like we talked about before, because chances are the casting moved around. Line that up, tighten it back on, and you've got yourself a new handle. All right, and you're ready to ring again. And so the last step in maintenance is to just give it a nice hand polishing. Maybe every 6 months or so. Even with sunshine claws, you're eventually going to need to hand polish with cream, and it's not too hard at all. We have just a clean soft rag polishing wipe that we're using. You're going to want to have 2 of them on hand because you're going to use one for putting the polish on and the other one to take it off. If you try to do it all in one, you're just going to be smearing polish around forever and you're going to get nowhere. So you're just going to put a little bit on there and just rub it all around the casting. Generally an up and down motion to start is good, just to spread it all around the casting and to get off any stains. And then after you've got that all around, you'll take your off rag, as we call it, and you're going to remove all of that. Again, you can start in that up and down motion, but as you finish, finishing in a circular motion can help get some of the last bits of polish off of there. And at Malmark, we even go a step further than that, because while this may look clean to you here, there's actually some leftover polish residue that you can't see. And I'm going to show you that I'm polishing on this white paper because as I turn the casting, and I know you can't see it on camera, you'll have to take my word for it, I can see all this residue left over at the bottom that you wouldn't see if you're just holding the bell up in front of you. So that's where our friend Sunshine Cloth comes in, takes off all that leftover residue for a final shine, and now it's perfectly clean. So at this point, I think we're ready for some more questions. So if you have a question about handbell maintenance, making adjustments, or polishing, go ahead and unmute yourself and we'll take some more questions.
Hi, I guess I can talk. This is Cheryl.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi. Okay, I have a couple of questions. I have a clapper that, you know, in the clapper, when you move the clappers to different settings, you can almost hear it click a little bit.
Yes.
Or feel it. I have one that really doesn't want to stay in that. So is that slotted washer you were talking about that could be on wrong?
It's possible. It's also possible that the indexing spring could be missing altogether, because then that would mean that pin has nothing to click into, which would then cause the head to just spin uncontrollably. That is one possibility.
Okay, okay. Um, and the polish, we've always used the Simichrome. Is that okay? Or you were using the tube? I know there's,
You can use semichrome. This is what we use Blue Magic here in the factory, but there are other metal polishes on the market that you can use.
okay. All right, I thought we got them from you, or maybe we got it from Jefferson. I don't know, but
Yeah.
okay.
As long as it's non-abrasive, because you don't want anything that's going to scratch your cast.
Right, right. Okay.
You know, and when you're polishing your bells, periodically check those rags. Make sure you're not getting any debris stuck in them, because if you get something caught in your rag, and then you go to polish the next bell, you could end up scratching your bell. So you do want to make sure that you're not getting anything stuck in your rag. And if it is and you can't get it out, take a fresh wipe, because
Okay,
you don't want to spread the love.
we're using cotton cloths to
Okay.
polish. Is that okay?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Cotton is very good. It's absorbent. It's soft. As long as
And
it's
then,
reasonably clean. Yes.
right,
You
and
can
then
use an old t-shirt.
I wash it every time we're done. I wash it and they're fine. Then you can reuse them
Yeah, if you're using like an old t-shirt, you can do that. I would say if you're gonna wash them, that to not use
then.
fabric
The dryer.
softener. You want
Yeah,
to try to avoid any excess chemical in the
exactly.
final rinse.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions?
I have a question. This is Esther.
Hi, Esther.
I teach bells for 7th and 8th graders. And I
That's
have one that one bell that just that screw in the clapper head seems to just keep coming loose. And I just keep tightening it, but what am I missing? Because it just happens over and over again.
Okay, so my first question is, are you removing the clapper assembly completely out of the bell first, or are you doing it just on the table, trying to do it as it's fully assembled?
I'm trying to do it as it's fully assembled. I didn't know anything that like I could even take them apart until today. So
I would definitely recommend trying to disassemble it so that you can get some better leverage. Um, when I'm trying to tighten that screw, I actually hold down with the heel of my hand down on the table to keep it still, and then take the screwdriver with my bare hand and tighten it that way. Because if you're trying to do it inside the bell, you're trying to be careful not to slip and not to scratch the bell, and it's
right.
hard to get enough leverage to tighten it. So I would recommend try to disassemble the whole thing first.
Okay.
Any other questions?
That's my main problem right now.
All right. If there aren't any other questions, then we bid you a fond farewell. We wish you happy ringing, and we thank you for joining us today. Just a reminder, all of our Studio 440 classes can be found on our YouTube page. Just search for Malmark Bell Craftsman, and you can find all of them. Oh, I remember what I forgot. Just one moment. This is the time protector that I did not come prepared with. It is a block of foam, and you just insert it into the top of the tine there. So that keeps those tines from bending inward. So very important thing to keep in your bass chimes. Okay, now I think we're done. So thank you all for joining us, and happy ringing.
Thank you.